The government can steal your house. That's right. Imagine you have saved up for 10 years. You're finally ready to settle down. You find a new house to move in. And then a man in a suit knocks on your door and tells you, "Unfortunately, I have to kick you out of your house. The government's taking it." You ask him what for. You would assume some sort of road or highway or even some sort of military facility. But nope, they're taking it for a corporation's center of operations. This really happened. How did we get here? And why can this happen? Hello, I'm Andrew Holmes, and this is why the government messes everything up. Our story starts with the Bill of Rights. You know, that thing that was meant to protect our liberties and keep us free. Well, at the end of the Fifth Amendment, there's the Takings Clause, which states that no private property shall be taken for public use without just compensation. In other words, the government can take your property as long as it's for public use and they pay you whatever they deem to be just compensation. Now, of course, the meaning of this document, as with much of the rest of the Constitution, grew as it was interpreted by the Supreme Courts over time. One of the first major cases around this was the case of Berman versus Parker in the 50s. What happened in this case was essentially the government in Washington, D.C. wanted to tear down and rebuild what they deemed to be blighted districts. Blight can be physical damage that poses health risks, economic damage, aesthetic damage, or pretty much anything else the government doesn't like. So, what happened in this case is that they gave the district that they deemed to be blighted in DC to a private company to rebuild. And in this district, there was a shop owned by a man named Berman. And this shop itself was not blighted, but it was in the district, so it was going to be taken by eminent domain. And because of this, he basically challenged it in court. And ultimately, the court ruled unanimously, 8-0, in favor of the use of eminent domain. This set the precedent that the government could screw everything up by basically giving them an unlimited amount of freedom in what they deem to be public use of your property. And this was only the beginning. All of this would lead to a far worse, much more infamous case in Kelo versus the City of New London. The case started because the City of New London wanted to use land that houses were built on in order to boost economic productivity and tax revenue. Pfizer had decided to build the new $300 million facility, and the city wanted more economic development in the area to complement it. They decided to use eminent domain to obtain this land from the people. However, several families held out, at the lead being Suzette Kelo, who is the owner of a famous pink house from this case. After 7 years in court, the Supreme Court reached a very controversial 5-4 decision in favor of the city. The government got their way and tore the neighborhood down. The great irony of this case, however, is that the bad PR from removing their houses led to the property becoming far too much of a hazard for the PR of any development, and because of that, there ultimately was no new private development on the land, and it still to the day largely remains undeveloped. And, to add salt into the wound, Pfizer would ultimately decide to move away from this facility, shutting it down, funnily enough, right when they had to start paying higher taxes. After Berman vs. Parker opened the door to nearly anything being considered public use for eminent domain, Kelo versus the City of London showed the logical ends of this. Property rights now seem more like a suggestion, and the City of New London was left with nothing more than a bad reputation, a neighborhood in ruins, and one of the grossest expansions of government power in United States history. I now want to talk about the fundamental flaw with eminent domain. If I had to sum it up in a few words, eminent domain turns property rights into property suggestions. Objectively speaking, eminent domain is theft and desecration of private property. The state is taking the property that a person has ownership over by force, and then the destruction of that property after its forceful removal from its owner. One thing to note is that it technically is a forced transaction rather than a pure theft. However, using a market price does not reflect the actual price the owner is not willing to sell, as the actual price is determined by whatever the owner is willing to sell at. And that is exactly what happens in the case of eminent domain use. Basically, the owner's right to not sell is being violated, and this is still theft, just as it would be theft if someone took $10 from you but gave you $5 in exchange. The most common view that might try to claim that this is somehow not theft is the social contract theory. The social contract theory would state that since we live in a society, we have an implied consent to the rules of society or the social contract, which is necessary to keep order. This view, however, is flawed on two counts. For one, there are people who explicitly reject the social contract. And number two, the idea of implied consent leads to disastrous logical consequences. To see why, I propose a thought experiment. Imagine an island where 10 people are living in a community. They have a system of democratic rule and all gather around the campfire to vote each night. Steve spends all day gathering coconuts, while everyone else on the island lounges around. At the fire, they vote to redistribute Steve's coconuts to everyone else, leaving Steve with just enough to get by. "That's not fair," Steve says. Another islander responds, "Of course it's fair. Your consent is implied through the social contract. Now let's have a vote. Who says we make Steve start dancing for his coconuts?" To which they all vote that he does. The point is, clearly, implied consent is not an adequate justification for the abuse of Steve's rights on this island. And the results of this idea can get even more absurd, as according to this doctrine of implied consent, they could do virtually whatever they want with Steve. Despite the clear issue eminent domain has with property rights, the Founding Fathers still saw this as necessary to develop infrastructure such as roads. However, there are multiple problems with this view. First off, I would dispute the necessity in order to build public infrastructure. For instance, when building a road, if someone refuses to sell, it can be routed differently. There will always be a creative solution that respects property rights. Further, even if it is absolutely necessary for whatever infrastructure the state deems necessary for public use, the public is solely made up of individuals, and since the public does not exist without the individual, by violating one individual's rights, we are actually causing greater damage to the public than we gain by targeting whatever good is seen in the public interest. Basically, by taking the public good as prior to the individual right, we are treating an abstract concept as more real than the actual individual, and doing a great injustice in the process. The individual should take priority in a legal process above a collective, since the individual is what is actually there, and the collective is just a mental shortcut in grouping individuals. Now, even if you are unwilling to fully eliminate this unjust ability of the government to essentially take property as it pleases, most should still agree that it should be limited. And this is where we see hope. One important fact that I did not yet mention about Kelo is that after the case had concluded, public pressure led to many states reforming their eminent domain laws, including several states actually changing their constitution to limit the use of eminent domain. For example, Florida and Michigan both passed amendments to get rid of economic development as a reason to use eminent domain. So, even though the government may tend to grow larger, increase its power, and trample on our rights more over time, as we saw with the cases of Berman v. Parker and Kelo v. City of New London, we as individuals still have a responsibility to advocate for our rights, because with enough pressure, the government will be forced to change, limit itself, and protect our rights. And most importantly, with the power of our influence, we can stop the government from messing everything up.